The rain falls cold and relentless on the Mediterranean, turning the place du Palais into a mirror of wet cobblestones. It is the night of June 29th, 1652. Inside the prince's palace of Monaco, a young man named Honoré II waits in the Hall of Mirrors, his reflection fractured 1,000 times by the guttering light of candles. He is not waiting for a guest. He is waiting for a sound. The air is thick with the smell of saltpeter from the sea and the hot wax dripping onto the stone floor. In his hand he clutches a letter, the seal already broken. The words within are a death sentence. Your fortress is surrounded. Surrender the rock or we will tear it down stone by stone. Outside, unseen in the darkness, 12,000 Spanish soldiers are digging trenches, positioning cannons aimed directly at his bedchamber. Honoré is 25 years old. He rules a country smaller than many royal estates. He has no army, no allies, and no time. As the first cannonball screams across the harbor and slams into the cliff face below him, the entire palace vibrates like a struck bell. The Grimaldi dynasty, which has clung to this rock for over 500 years, is facing its final hour. The question echoing in that shaking hall is the same one that has haunted this family for centuries. How do the smallest survive when the giants go to war? To understand how a family of outlaws and exiles built the longest reigning dynasty in European history, we must sail back to the night it all began, to a man in a hood, a sword in the dark, and a fortress lit only by the moon, shall we? Chapter 1: The Ghost and the Rock. To speak of the Grimaldi is to speak of stone. Not just any stone, but a specific jagged promontory jutting into the Ligurian Sea. A lump of dolomitic limestone the locals call Le Rocher, the rock. It is a place where the wind never seems to stop, whipping the cypress trees into a permanent lean and carrying the salt spray up to the very walls of the palace that now crowns its peak. But before there was a palace, before there were princes and casinos and movie stars, there was only the rock. And on the night of January 8th, 1297, there was a man who wanted it. His name was Francesco Grimaldi. To his friends and to history he was known by a darker name, Il Malizia, the Cunning. He was a man born into a war. In the late 13th century, his native Genoa was tearing itself apart, a civil war between the established nobles and the rising merchant classes. The Grimaldis, an ancient and powerful family, had backed the wrong side. They were declared rebels, their property confiscated, their heads priced. Francesco and his cousins became men without a home, political refugees in a world that had no patience for refugees. They survived by becoming what their enemies called them, pirates. They prowled the Mediterranean in swift galleys, preying on the ships of their rivals, clinging to a bitter existence on the fringes of the sea. But piracy was a means to an end. What they truly craved was a home, a base, a rock of their own. And so their eyes fell upon Monaco. At the time, the rock was a fortress manned by a garrison loyal to their enemies, the Genoese. It was a thorn in the side of anyone who opposed Genoa, a symbol of the power that had crushed them. Taking it by force was impossible. The Grimaldis had a handful of ships and perhaps 100 men. The fortress was built to withstand an army. Francesco understood a truth that would define his family for centuries. When you are weak, you do not fight, you outthink. The plan he devised was not one of siege engines and broadsides, but of theater. He knew the garrison, knew their routine. He knew that the guards at the gate, bored and cold in the January air, longed for any distraction. He knew that men of God were rarely treated as threats. So Francesco Grimaldi, the outlaw, the pirate, the exile, dressed himself in the rough wool robes of a Franciscan monk. He pulled the hood low over his face. Behind him, a small group of his most trusted men followed suit, their swords hidden in the folds of their coarse habits. They did not sail to Monaco. They rowed. In a small boat, under the cover of a moonless night, they crossed the dark water, the only sound the dip of their muffled oars and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. They landed on the rocky shore below the fortress, their feet finding purchase on the slick, wet stone. They climbed the narrow, winding path to the main gate, their breath plumbing in the cold air. As they approached, the sentry on the wall called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. Francesco, his face hidden, replied in a humble, weary tone. He was a simple monk, he said, lost in the night, seeking shelter from the wind for himself and his brothers. The gate creaked open, just a crack, just enough. It was all the room a ghost needed. In that single moment, the history of the Mediterranean pivoted. As the guard stepped forward to greet the shivering monk, Francesco's hand shot out from beneath his robe. It held not a rosary but a sword. Historians would later record the event in a single chilling line: Entro con l'ingano. He entered by deception. Francesco Grimaldi, the ghost in the monk's hood, did not just open the gate that night. He unlocked a future that would last 1,000 years. The first blow was silent. It had to be. The success of Il Malizia's plan depended on chaos remaining inside the walls until his cousin, Rainier, could bring the main force of their men up from the ships. Once the guard at the postern gate fell, Francesco and his disguised men moved with the practiced silence of wolves. They knew the layout of the fortress. Every pirate in the region knew the layout of Monaco. It was the prize. They ghosted through the outer bailey, their sandaled feet making no sound on the frozen ground. They dispatched the sleeping garrison not with the clash of battle, but with the cold efficiency of an execution. A hand over a mouth, the quick, brutal thrust of a dagger, the gurgle of a life ended before a scream could form. Imagine the scene from the inside. A soldier, warming his hands over a brazier, hears a rustle. He turns, expecting to see a fellow guard. Instead, he sees a figure in a dark robe, face in shadow, and before he can react, the steel is in his throat. The smell of his own blood mixes with the smoke of the fire. In another chamber, a captain sleeps soundly, dreaming of his wife in Genoa. He never wakes up. The Grimaldis were not just taking a fortress. They were erasing the previous owners from the ledger. By the time Rainier Grimaldi led the main force up the cliff path, the gate was open, and the rock belonged to them. The entire operation lasted less than an hour. The sun rose that morning on a new reality, a flag with the Grimaldi colors, a lozenge of white and red fluttering over the highest tower. But taking the rock was one thing, keeping it was another. The Genoese reacted with predictable fury. They sent ships, they sent armies, they offered bounty. For the next several decades, the Grimaldis were not rulers of Monaco so much as tenants under constant threat of eviction. They clung to their prize by a combination of bribery, shifting alliances, and sheer maritime skill. They were, after all, pirates. They knew how to fight from the sea. They patrolled their waters, intercepting Genoese supply ships, and using the fortress as a base to strike back at their enemy. The rock became a hornet's nest, and the Grimaldis were the hornets. This period forged the family's character. They were not born to a throne, they had seized it with a knife in the dark. They were not legitimate in the eyes of the great powers, they were adventurers, opportunists. A letter from a Genoese official from this time, preserved in the state archives, seethes with frustrated rage. He writes to his master, "These Grimaldi are like lice. You can pick them off, but their eggs remain in the seams. They will not be dislodged by honor or by force, for they possess neither." It was meant as an insult, but for the Grimaldis it was a compliment. They understood that survival was not about honor, it was about tenacity. They had nothing, no land, no titles, no legitimacy, and then they had a single, windswept rock. They would not let it go, not for a king, not for an empire, not for anything. And as the 14th century wore on, this tenacity would be tested to its absolute limit, because the giants were beginning to stir. France to the west was sharpening its claws, Spain to the south was amassing its gold, and the Grimaldis, the lice on their rock, were right in the middle. The 14th and 15th centuries were a long, bloody education for the House of Grimaldi. They learned that a small dynasty survives not by being the strongest, but by being the most useful. They became masters of a dangerous game, offering their fortress and their fleet as a prize to whichever Mediterranean power could guarantee their safety. For a time, they pledged themselves to the French crown, serving as the kings of France's eyes and swords in the unruly Ligurian Sea. French warships sheltered in the harbor of Monaco. French gold filled the Grimaldi coffer. In return, the Grimaldis harried the ships of France's enemy. It was a comfortable arrangement, but it came with a price: dependence. When the French king had a change of heart or a shift in policy, the Grimaldis felt the ground shift beneath them. In 1419, they were stripped of their rights, and Monaco was absorbed back into the Genoese sphere. The family scattered once more, returning to the life of exile they thought they had escaped. For over a decade, the rock was lost. It must have seemed like the dream was over, that Francesco's midnight gamble had only bought them a century of borrowed time. But the Grimaldis, as they had proven, were patient. They waited, they watched, and they saw that Genoa, for all its power, was weak. It was a republic torn by the same internal factions that had exiled the Grimaldis in the first place. The family began to buy their way back. They loaned money to this faction, offered ships to that one. They made themselves indispensable. In 1436, a Grimaldi once again sailed into the harbor of Monaco, but this time it was not with a sword in the dark. It was with a contract in his hand. Jean Grimaldi, a descendant of Francesco's cousin Rainier, had negotiated the return of the family's property. He was not a conqueror, he was a landlord. He paid 12,000 golden florins for the feudal rights to Monaco. It was, in essence, the first time the Grimaldis legally bought their own home. This was a pivotal transformation. The family began to shift from being pirates and adventurers to being administrators and lords. They built walls not just for defense but to define a border. They collected taxes, not just spoils. They started to see themselves as rulers of a state, however tiny. The old pirate instincts never fully faded. They would always be useful, but a new identity was being forged. They were becoming princes. And as the 15th century bled into the 16th, a new threat emerged that would force them to fully commit to this identity, forcing a choice that would define Monaco for the next 200 years. The King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor were about to go to war for the soul of Italy, and the Grimaldi's little rock was suddenly the most strategically valuable piece of real estate in the Western Mediterranean. The question was no longer if they could hold it. It was who they would have to surrender it to in order to keep it. And the answer, when it came, would require a sacrifice that cut to the very heart of their family. Chapter 2: The Prisoner and the Pirate. To stand on the ramparts of Monaco in the early 16th century was to witness a world on fire. Look west, toward Provence, and you might see the banners of the French king's army marching toward Italy. Look east, toward Genoa, and the horizon was dark with the galleys of Spain, their sails emblazoned with the double-headed eagle of the Habsburg Empire. The Mediterranean had become a chessboard, and the pieces were kingdom. For the Lord of Monaco, Lucien Grimaldi, the view from those ramparts was not a spectacle. It was a nightmare. He ruled a territory that was not quite a country, a fortress that was not quite a city. It was a single, solitary pawn sitting exactly where two opposing queens were about to collide. Lucien was a practical man. He had inherited the rock in 1505, following the death of his brother, Jean II, in a family dispute that was as brutal as it was swift. Jean had been stabbed by Lucien's other brother, a reminder that Grimaldi politics had always been a blood sport. By the time Lucien stabilized his rule, the world outside his walls had descended into the Italian wars, a decades-long slugfest between the Valois kings of France and the Habsburg emperors of Spain for control of the Italian peninsula. Every port, every island, every rocky outcrop had value, and Monaco, perched on the border between France and the Italian states, guarding the maritime route to Genoa and Naples, was invaluable. Lucien understood his predicament with the clarity of a man staring into an abyss. He was a flea attempting to negotiate a truce between two starving wolves. He received visitors constantly, French ambassadors in silk, Spanish emissaries in black velvet. They came with promises of protection and threats of annihilation, often in the same sentence. The French king, Francis I, was particularly insistent. He saw Monaco as a natural extension of his realm, a dagger pointed at the heart of his Spanish rivals. He offered Lucien money, titles, and a French bride. He also made it clear that refusal would be considered an act of war. Lucien, walking the same stone corridors his ancestor Francesco had seized in the night, felt the walls closing in. He wrote letters to his mother, seeking counsel, his quill scratching desperately in the candlelight. The documents from this period, preserved in the princely archives, reveal a man stretched to the breaking point. He speaks of the great tempests that surround him, and his fear that this poor house will be swept away. He was not a warrior like his forefather. He was a diplomat trying to perform a miracle. The miracle, when it came, was not of his choosing. In 1515, Francis I of France achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Marignano, cementing French control over much of northern Italy. The French no longer needed to negotiate with Monaco, they could dictate. A French fleet appeared in the harbor not to attack but to observe. French troops began to patrol the borderland. The message was unmistakable: join us or be absorbed by us. Lucien, cornered, agreed to a treaty. He would place Monaco under the protection of the French crown. He would allow a French garrison in the fortress. In return, he would keep his title, his lands, and his life. But as Lucian signed the document, he could feel the eyes of Spain upon him. He had made an enemy of the most powerful empire in the world, and the Spanish, unlike the French, had a navy that could reach him. The ink was barely dry on the French treaty when the Spanish began to move. They did not send ambassadors this time. They sent a spy. And this spy carried a message that would turn Lucian's world upside down, proving that in the game of princes, a signature on a piece of paper was worth less than the whisper of a traitor in the dark. The Spanish spy was a man named Bartolomeo Doria, a Genoese nobleman with old scores to settle against the French and a network of informants that stretched across the Ligurian coast. He did not approach Lucian directly. Instead, he found his way to Lucian's younger brother, Augustine. Augustine Grimaldi was a man of God, the Bishop of Grasse, but his piety was matched by a ruthless political instinct. He saw what Lucian perhaps refused to see, that the French treaty was a leash. Monaco was becoming a puppet, its strings pulled from Paris. Doria's proposition was simple and seductive. Abandon the French alliance, he whispered. Turn to Spain. The Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in the world, would guarantee Monaco's independence. He would shower the Grimaldis with gold, with honors, with a future. All they had to do was open the gates to a Spanish garrison and close them to the French. The offer split the Grimaldi family down the middle. Lucian, wary of Spanish power and bound by his word to the French king, hesitated. Augustine saw an opportunity. He believed that Spain, far away in Madrid, was a safer master than France, which was a hungry neighbor always at the gate. The brothers argued in the private chambers of the palace, their voices echoing off the stone walls. According to a contemporary chronicler, Lucian accused Augustine of wanting to sell the rock to the highest bidder. Augustine retorted that Lucian was too naive to rule, that he would trade our birthright for a French smile. The tension simmered for months. Then, in the summer of 1523, it boiled over. Lucian, perhaps hoping to ease the strain, retreated to his country estate at Menton, a few miles along the coast. It was a fatal mistake. The walls of Monaco were thick with guards. Menton was vulnerable. On the night of August 22nd, a small boat landed on a secluded beach near the estate. The men who stepped ashore were not Spanish soldiers. They were agents, sent by Doria with a single, clear objective: remove Lucian Grimaldi. What happened next is recorded in the cold, precise language of a legal inquest held days later. Lucian was in his bedchamber when his servants announced the arrival of urgent messengers from Genoa. He received them in his private study, trusting in the lateness of the hour and the supposed loyalty of his guests. As he leaned forward to read the documents they presented, one of the men drew a short sword and plunged it into his chest. Lucian fell without a sound. The assassins fled into the night, back to their boat, back to the Spanish gold that had paid for their blades. Lucian Grimaldi, the prince who had tried to navigate between giants, bled out on the floor of his own home. He left behind a widow and children, and a principality suddenly leaderless, in chaos, and staring directly into the eyes of an avenging French king. The murder of a sovereign prince, even a minor one, was an act of war. The question now was not whether Monaco would survive, but who would rule the ashes. News of Lucian's assassination reached the palace at dawn. The Grimaldi family, already fractured by suspicion, now convulsed with fear and fury. Lucian's heir was his young son, Honoré, barely a year old. A regent was needed, someone to hold the rock together until the child came of age. There was only one candidate with the authority, the ruthlessness, and the proximity to power to do it: Bishop Augustine Grimaldi, the brother of the murdered prince. To this day, historians debate Augustine's complicity. Was he the architect of his brother's death, clearing a path for his own regency and a pro-Spanish policy? Or was he a man who saw an opportunity in tragedy, seizing control to prevent the family from tearing itself apart? The documents offer no confession, only circumstantial evidence. What is certain is that within weeks of Lucian's murder, Augustine had taken control of Monaco, expelled the French garrison, and opened the gates to the Spanish. He signed a new treaty with Emperor Charles V, placing Monaco under Spanish protection. The rock had switched masters in a river of blood. The French response was swift. King Francis I declared Augustine a murderer and a traitor. French warships blockaded the harbor. French agents circulated pamphlets across Europe, painting the Grimaldis as a family of assassins and turncoats. The Grimaldi name, once synonymous with cunning survival, now risked becoming synonymous with treachery. For the family, the years that followed were a siege of the soul. They were trapped on their rock, surrounded by enemies, dependent entirely on the distant and often distracted power of Spain. Augustine ruled as regent for over 7 years, a grim, isolated figure. He pored over accounts, strengthened the fortifications, and prayed in the chapel his brother had once used. The price of survival, he must have understood, was eternal vigilance and eternal guilt. When he died in 1532, he left the regency to another man, and the cycle of suspicion continued. Young Honoré II, the boy who had lost his father to an assassin's blade, grew up in a palace where every shadow seemed to hold a dagger. He learned that trust was a luxury his family could not afford, and that the love between brothers could curdle into murder. By the time Honoré assumed personal rule in the 1540s, the pattern was set. Monaco existed at the pleasure of Spain. Spanish troops manned the walls. Spanish officials audited the treasury. The Grimaldis were princes in name, but in reality, they were prisoners in their own home. The dynasty had survived, but at what cost? The family that had once seized the rock with a single, daring stroke was now little more than a Spanish governor with a family crest. The fire of independence that had driven Francesco Grimaldi had been reduced to embers, banked by the cold pragmatism of empire. And as the decades wore on, as the 16th century gave way to the 17th, those embers would begin to cool. The Grimaldis became quiet, cautious, and ever more isolated. They began to look inward, to the private sorrows of their own bloodline. And in that isolation, a new story began to take root, a story not of battles and treaties, but of love, loss, and the whispered legend of a curse that would come to define them just as powerfully as the rock itself. Chapter 3. The Curse of the Grimaldi. Every dynasty has its shadows. For the Habsburgs, it was the genetic blight of consanguinity, the jutting jaw, the stillborn heirs. For the Borgias, it was the stain of poison and papal sin. But for the Grimaldis, the shadow was not of the body or the hand. It was of the heart. It began not with a dramatic death or a political betrayal, but with something far more intimate, the failure of love. By the late 16th century, as Monaco settled into its long, quiet slumber under Spanish watch, the princes of the rock found themselves confronting a puzzle that no treaty could solve. Again and again they married. Again and again their marriages curdled into estrangement, tragedy, or simply emptiness. The heirs they so desperately needed either died in the cradle, or worse, never came at all. The first whispers of what would later be called the Grimaldi curse emerged during the reign of Honoré II, the same young man we left trembling in the Hall of Mirrors as Spanish cannons roared in the night. But before the siege, before the cannons, there was a wedding. In 1615, at the age of 18, Honoré was married to a Roman noblewoman, Ippolita Trivulzio. It was an arrangement, of course. All Grimaldi marriages were arrangements, but by the standards of the time, it held promise. Ippolita was young, beautiful, and connected to the powerful papal courts. The wedding was celebrated with festivities that lasted for days. Fireworks lit the Mediterranean sky. The people of Monaco danced in the streets. For a brief, glittering moment, the rock seemed to have found its princess. But the fireworks faded, and the stone walls closed in. Ippolita, raised in the vibrant, gossipy salons of Rome, found Monaco a prison. She wrote letters to her family, preserved now in the Vatican archives, that paint a picture of profound isolation. She speaks of the endless sighing of the sea that keeps her awake at night, of the cold courtesy of the palace servants who treat her as a foreign object, and of her husband, Honoré, who seemed more devoted to his books and his maps than to her. She writes, "I am a bird in a cage of stone. The sky I see from my window is the same sky every day. I fear I will forget there is a world beyond this rock." Honoré, for his part, was a man consumed by his own burden. He had inherited a principality that was not truly his, a vassal state of Spain where every decision required approval from Madrid. The pressure of ruling, of maintaining the fiction of sovereignty while bowing to a foreign master, left him little room for the tenderness of a young wife. The marriage, born of politics, withered from neglect. They shared a bed but not a life. They produced heirs, 2 sons, but the joy was short-lived. The firstborn died in infancy, a common tragedy of the era, but one that cut deeper in the cold silence of that palace. The second son, Urkel, survived, but the bond between his parents never recovered. When Hippolyta died young in 1638, the court of Monaco barely paused for mourning. It was as if she had been a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Honoré remarried quickly, this time to a French noblewoman, but that union was equally devoid of warmth. The pattern was set. Generation after generation, Grimaldi princes would marry for state, produce an heir if they were lucky, and then retreat into their own worlds of politics, of mistresses, of the solitary pursuit of power. The women who came to the rock withered, emotionally if not physically, and the people of Monaco began to talk. By the 18th century, the talk had hardened into legend. The Grimaldi curse, as it became known, was a simple, devastating prophecy. No Grimaldi would ever find lasting happiness in marriage. The family, it was said, had seized the rock by violence and deceit, and the price of that original sin was paid in the coin of the heart. Every wedding would carry the seed of its own sorrow. Every prince would love his throne more than his wife. Every princess who came to Monaco would eventually come to regret it. The reign of Prince Anton I, who ruled from 1701 to 1731, seemed to prove the point. Anton was a man of immense physical vitality, a soldier who preferred the roar of cannons to the whisper of courtship. He was married off to Marie of Lorraine, a French aristocrat, in a union designed to strengthen ties with the French nobility, which had begun to eclipse Spanish influence in Monaco. Marie arrived at the palace expecting a husband. She found a general. Anton spent most of his time at his military encampments, or indulging in a very public affair with a woman named Elizabeth Charlotte de Lorraine, coincidentally, his wife's own sister-in-law. The affair was conducted with such blatant disregard for decorum that it became the talk of every court in Europe. Marie, humiliated and isolated, retreated to her apartments, filling her days with prayer and her letters with barely concealed despair. In one surviving letter to her mother, she writes, "I am married to a man who does not see me. I am a ghost in my own home, wandering halls that belong to another woman's laughter." The tragedy of Anton's reign, however, was not just personal. It was dynastic. Despite his vigor, despite his multiple affairs, Anton and Marie produced only daughters, 6 of them, 6 princesses, and not a single male heir to carry the Grimaldi name into the future. The law of Monaco, like most of Europe, barred women from inheriting the throne. When Anton died in 1731, the direct male line of the Grimaldis, the line that stretched back to Francesco il Malizia, died with him. The rock faced its most profound crisis since the Spanish siege. The heir was Anton's eldest daughter, Louise Hippolyte, but she was a woman, and her husband, Jacques de Goyon de Matignon, a French nobleman, was a foreigner. To save the dynasty, a legal fiction was created. Louise Hippolyte would rule as Princess of Monaco, and upon her death, her husband would take the Grimaldi name and rule in her stead. It was a desperate measure, a patchwork solution that barely held together. Louise Hippolyte, finally given the chance to rule, surprised everyone. She embraced her role with a passion that her father had reserved for war. She rode through the streets of Monaco, greeting her subjects, listening to their grievances. She began to reform the principality's archaic laws. For the first time in decades, the palace felt alive. But the curse, if that is what it was, had not finished with the Grimaldi. After a reign of barely 6 months, Louise Hippolyte fell suddenly, violently ill. She died in December 1731, at the age of 34. The doctors called it smallpox. The people of Monaco whispered of poison, of the curse striking down anyone who dared to bring warmth to the cold stone of the rock. Her husband, now Prince Honoré III, took control, and with his ascension, the Grimaldi name passed to a man who was not born to it, a man whose blood carried none of the pirate cunning of Francesco, none of the desperate diplomacy of Lucian. The dynasty survived, but it was a survival built on a lie. And as the 18th century marched toward its revolutionary climax, that lie would be exposed in the most brutal way imaginable. The Grimaldis, already cursed in love, were about to learn that they could also be cursed in history. Honoré III, the Frenchman who became a Grimaldi by marriage, was a child of the Enlightenment. He read Voltaire. He corresponded with Rousseau. He redesigned his gardens in the latest French fashion and filled his palace with the finest art from Paris. He looked at Monaco, that ancient, superstitious rock, with the eyes of a modern man. He saw it as a quaint anachronism, a source of income to fund his sophisticated tastes. He spent most of his reign not in Monaco but in Paris, Versailles, and his lavish estates in France. The rock was left to administrator, the palace to ghosts. This neglect, this cultural divorce between the prince and his people would prove catastrophic. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Honoré III was in Paris. He watched, with a mixture of horror and disbelief, as the world he knew was dismantled. His beloved Enlightenment ideals, which had celebrated reason and progress, now manifested as the guillotine and the mob. His French property, the source of his wealth and his identity, were seized by the revolutionary government. He was declared an enemy of the people, not because of anything he had done but because of what he was: a prince, an aristocrat, a symbol of the old order. In 1793, the National Convention in Paris voted to annex Monaco. The Grimaldi name was erased. The palace was looted, its paintings sold, its furniture smashed, its archives scattered. The building itself was turned into a military hospital, the elegant halls filled with the stench of gangrene and the screams of dying soldiers. The rock, which Francesco had seized with a sword in the night, now belonged to the French Republic. The Grimaldis, meanwhile, were scattered across Europe, penniless and stateless. Honoré III, the sophisticated prince who had preferred Paris to his own capital, died in obscurity in 1795, a refugee in a world that had no use for princes. His wife, the last direct Grimaldi, had already perished in the chaos, a victim of the revolutionary terror. For 20 years, the Grimaldis ceased to exist. They were a footnote in history, a forgotten family clinging to a memory of a rock they no longer owned. The curse, if it existed, had reached its final, terrible conclusion. The dynasty had been extinguished not by a sword, but by the tide of history itself. The name that had survived for 5 centuries was now just another entry in the registry of the dead. But the story does not end there. From the ashes of exile, from the humiliation of poverty, a new Grimaldi would emerge. He would find his way back to the rock, not as a conqueror, not as a prince, but as a beggar asking for scraps. And in that moment of utter defeat, he would plant the seed of the most improbable resurrection the dynasty had ever seen. The Grimaldis were about to return from the grave, but the world they came back to was one of steam and steel, of newspapers and nouveau riches. To survive in this new world, they would have to learn a new game. They would have to gamble. Chapter 4: The Revolution and the Empty Throne. To understand what it means to lose everything, one must walk the corridors of the Monaco Palace in the winter of 1793. The Grimaldi furniture, the gilded chairs where princes had sat for centuries, had been carted away and sold at auction to pay revolutionary debts. The portraits of Francesco il Malizia, of Lucian, of Honoré II, slashed by bayonets and tossed into bonfires in the palace courtyard. The library, painstakingly assembled over generations, its volumes bound in leather and stamped with the Grimaldi crest, had been ripped from the shelves and used as kindling by soldiers who could not read. And in the great hall of mirrors, where Honoré II had once awaited his doom, there now lay rows of wooden cots, each occupied by a feverish soldier of the French Republic. The smell of sickness, of unwashed bodies and rotting bandages, hung in the air like a fog. The rock, for the first time in 5 centuries, no longer belonged to the Grimaldis. It belonged to France. It belonged to the Revolution. It belonged to no one. Honoré III, the last reigning prince before the fall, did not witness this desecration. He was hundreds of miles away, a prisoner in Paris, confined to the former palace of the Luxembourg, which had been converted into a revolutionary prison. He shared his cell with aristocrats who had once bowed to him, with merchants who had once supplied him, with common criminals who looked at his fine clothes, now frayed and stained, with a mixture of contempt and pity. The man who had dined with philosophers, who had corresponded with kings, now stood in line for a bowl of watery soup and listened to the distant thump of the guillotine doing its daily work. The documents from this period, fragmentary and desperate, reveal a man stripped of all illusion. In a letter smuggled out to a friend in Switzerland, Honoré writes, "I have learned that a man can survive on bread and water. I have learned that a title is worthless when the mob decides your head is worth a song. But I have not learned how to stop being a Grimaldi. That, it seems, is the one lesson prison cannot teach." He would die in that prison, or shortly after his release, in 1795. The official cause was stroke. Those who knew him said it was a broken heart. His son, Honoré IV, fared little better. Released from prison but stripped of his fortune, he wandered Europe with his wife and children, a ghost in search of a home. They stayed in drafty country houses belonging to distant relatives, in cramped apartments in Italian cities where no one knew their name. They sold the last of the family jewels, one by one, to pay for bread and candle. The children, including a young boy named Florestan, grew up not in a palace, but in the shadow of poverty, taught by their mother to be proud of a name that meant nothing to the world. It was a strange, suspended existence. The Grimaldis were princes of nowhere, rulers of a country that existed only on old maps and in their own memories. The family's exile lasted 21 years. 21 years of watching from the sidelines as Napoleon Bonaparte redrew the map of Europe, as empires rose and fell, as the world changed in ways the old princes could barely comprehend. For Florestan, who was just a child when the family fled Monaco, the rock became a myth, a story his mother told him at bedtime. He dreamed of its towers, its cliffs, its harbor, but he had no memory of it. He was a Grimaldi by blood, but in every other way he was a man without a country, a nobleman without a home. The turning point came in 1814. Napoleon, defeated for the first time and exiled to Elba, left a power vacuum that the old royal families of Europe rushed to fill. The Congress of Vienna, that great gathering of victors and vanquished, was called to restore order to a continent shattered by revolution and war. Among the thousands of claimants, the hundreds of delegations, the dozens of kings and princes jostling for recognition, stood a small, desperate figure, Honoré IV, come to beg for his inheritance. The Congress of Vienna was not a place for sentiment. It was a place for power, for territory, for strategic advantage. Monaco, that tiny speck on the Mediterranean, was of no interest to the great powers. Austria did not want it. Russia did not need it. Prussia had never heard of it. But France, now ruled by the restored Bourbon King Louis XVI, saw an opportunity. By restoring the Grimaldis, France could place a loyal, dependent family on a strategically valuable piece of coastline. It was not charity, it was politics. And so in 1815, the Treaty of Paris included a small, almost invisible clause. The Principality of Monaco was restored to the House of Grimaldi, but the restoration came with chains attached. Monaco would become a protectorate of the Kingdom of Sardinia, a buffer state between France and the Italian powers. The Grimaldis would rule, but they would rule under the watchful eye of a foreign garrison. They were back on the rock, but they were not free. When Florestan finally saw Monaco for the first time, he was a grown man. He stood on the deck of a small boat, watching the familiar silhouette of his mother's stories rise from the sea. But as the boat drew closer, his excitement curdled into something else. The palace, which he had imagined as a fairy tale castle, was a scarred, battered shell. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes from revolutionary skirmishes. The windows were dark, many of them shattered and boarded up. The gardens, once the pride of Honoré III, were a tangle of weeds. And the people who lined the harbor to watch their prince return were not cheering. They were staring silently at strangers who claimed to be their rulers. The Grimaldis had come home, but home was a ruin and the welcome was a grave. Florestan I, who became prince in 1841, was perhaps the most unlikely ruler in Grimaldi history. He had been raised on stories of glory but trained for nothing. He had no interest in politics, no head for finance, no stomach for the rigid protocols of court life. What he loved was the theater. As a young man in exile, he had fallen in love with an actress, Caroline Gibert, a woman of wit, intelligence, and no noble blood whatsoever. He married her against the wishes of his family, and together they lived a bohemian life in Paris, far from the cold stones of Monaco. When the crown fell to him, Florestan accepted it with the enthusiasm of a man accepting a life sentence. He spent as little time on the rock as possible, leaving the actual business of governing to his wife, Caroline, and to a succession of advisors. Caroline, now Princess Caroline, was the real ruler of Monaco. She was sharp, ambitious, and utterly devoted to restoring the family's fortunes. She reorganized the palace, cut costs, and tried to modernize the principality's archaic economy. But she was fighting against the tide. Monaco in the mid-19th century was a backwater. It had no industry, no natural resources, no strategic importance in a world of steam power and railroads. Its only exports were olives, lemons, and a vague sense of faded glory. The people were poor, the treasury was empty, and the neighboring towns of Menton and Roquebrune, which had been Grimaldi possessions for centuries, were in open revolt, demanding independence. By the time Florstan's son, Charles III, inherited the throne in 1856, the situation was dire. Menton and Roquebrune had seceded, backed by the Kingdom of Sardinia. Monaco was reduced to a single square mile of barren rock. The Grimaldis were princes of a postage stamp, rulers of a nation that could fit inside the gardens of Versailles. Charles III stood on the ramparts of his diminished domain and faced a simple, terrifying question. How do you make a country out of nothing? The old answers, alliances, marriages, wars, were no longer available. He had no army, no money, no leverage. He had only one asset left: the sun, the sea, and a name that still carried the echo of centuries. It was not much, but it was enough to place a bet. Charles III was about to gamble his entire inheritance on an idea so audacious, so morally dubious, that it would transform his family forever. He was going to build a casino. Chapter 5: The Gambler's Gamble. The plateau of Les Spélugues in the year 1856 was nothing but rock and wind, a barren, windswept stretch of coastline east of the palace. It had been avoided for centuries by the people of Monaco. Fishermen dried their nets there, but no one built homes, no one farmed. It was a place of scrub, brush, and lizards, where the mistral wind howled off the sea with such ferocity that even the hardiest soul sought shelter elsewhere. It was, in short, the last place on earth anyone would expect to find the future. And yet, on a gray morning in the spring of that year, Prince Charles III stood on that plateau, his coat whipping around his legs, and saw not barren rock, but gold. Charles was a man caught between two worlds. He had inherited a principality that was barely a principality at all. The secession of Menton and Roquebrune had stripped Monaco of 90% of its territory and its tax base. The treasury was so empty that palace servants often went unpaid. The royal family survived on credit and the kindness of distant relatives. Charles's wife, Antoinette, a Belgian noblewoman, wrote desperate letters to her family begging for loans just to keep the palace kitchens running. The situation was undignified, it was unsustainable, and it was about to force Charles into a decision that would define his dynasty for the next 2 centuries. The idea of a casino was not original to Charles. For decades, small gambling houses had operated in Monaco, catering to the occasional tourist or traveling merchant. But they were seedy, disreputable establishments, the kind of places where sailors lost their wages and locals lost their reputations. Charles envisioned something different. He imagined a casino so grand, so luxurious, that it would attract the crowned heads of Europe, the industrial barons of England, the railroad magnates of America. He imagined a palace of pleasure built on that barren plateau that would make Monaco not just solvent but famous. The problem was money. Charles had none. He could not build a palace of pleasure on credit and prayer. He needed a partner, someone with deep pockets and a willingness to take a risk on a tiny principality with no infrastructure, no customers, and no guarantee of success. He found that partner in a man named François Blanc, a French entrepreneur who had already made a fortune running a casino in the German spa town of Bad Homburg. Blanc was a genius of the gambling world, a man who understood that the secret to a successful casino was not just the games, but the experience. He built theaters, gardens, and concert halls. He attracted the wealthy and the beautiful, and he made them feel, for a few hours or a few days, that they were living in a dream. When Charles approached Blanc with his proposal, Blanc was intrigued but skeptical. Monaco was remote, inaccessible, and unknown. The railroad had not yet reached the Riviera. The journey from Paris took days over rough roads, but Blanc also saw the potential. The French Riviera was just beginning to be discovered by wealthy Europeans seeking winter sun. The climate was mild, the scenery spectacular. If a railroad could be built, if a luxury hotel could be constructed, if a casino of unparalleled elegance could rise on that barren plateau, then Monaco might just become the playground of the rich. Blanc agreed to take the gamble, but his terms were brutal. He demanded a 50-year monopoly on gambling in Monaco. He demanded control over the design and construction of the casino, and he demanded that the Grimaldis stay out of his way. Charles, desperate and with no other options, agreed. The fate of his dynasty was now in the hands of a gambler. The construction of the casino was an act of sheer will against the forces of nature. The barren rock of Les Spélugues had to be blasted and leveled. Water had to be piped in from miles away. Every brick, every pane of glass, every piece of marble had to be shipped by sea or hauled over treacherous mountain roads. Workers labored in the fierce mistral wind, their tools flying from their hands, their eyes filled with dust. The local population watched with a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. What kind of madness was this? Building a palace on a rock where nothing grew. But Francois Blanc was not building for the local. He was building for a future he could already see. He hired the finest architects in Europe, men who had designed opera houses and royal palaces. He filled the gaming rooms with crystal chandeliers, with gilt-edged mirrors, with velvet drapes that swallowed sound and created an atmosphere of intimate luxury. He named the new district not Les Spélugues, a name that meant the caves or the grotto, but Monte Carlo, Mount Charles, a name that honored the prince who had taken the gamble, while erasing all memory of the barren rock that had once stood there. The casino opened its doors in stages throughout the 1860s. At first, the customers trickled in slowly, a few adventurous English lords, a handful of Russian aristocrats escaping the St. Petersburg winter, the occasional French industrialist with money to burn. But as word spread, as the railroad finally reached the coast, as photographs of the new palace appeared in newspapers across Europe, the trickle became a flood. Monte Carlo became a sensation. It was everything Charles had dreamed, a place of beauty, of excitement, of escape. The wealthy came to gamble, yes, but they also came to see and be seen, to dance in the opera house, to stroll through the garden, to breathe the salt air and pretend, for a little while, that the world was nothing but pleasure. The financial impact on Monaco was immediate and transformative. The casino paid the principality a generous annual fee, and in return the Grimaldis agreed to a remarkable innovation. They abolished all direct taxes. The citizens of Monaco, the same people who had watched the construction with suspicion, now paid no income tax, no property tax, no head tax. It was an unheard-of luxury, a princely gift that bound the people to their rulers in a new way. Monaco became a tax haven, not just for the rich visitors, but for the locals themselves. The barren rock was now the luckiest rock in Europe. But the glitter of Monte Carlo masked a deeper, more troubling reality. The Grimaldis had staked their future on an industry that much of respectable society considered immoral. The church condemned gambling as a sin. The governments of France and Italy viewed the casino as a den of vice, a corrupting influence on their citizens. Charles III found himself in an impossible position. He was a prince by blood, a ruler by tradition, but his treasury was filled with the losses of gamblers, his reputation stained by the very enterprise that saved his dynasty. He dealt with this contradiction by withdrawing. He spent more and more time in the palace, away from the glittering crowds of Monte Carlo. He left the casino to Blanc and devoted himself to the traditional duties of a sovereign, receiving ambassadors, signing decrees, attending mass. But everyone knew the truth. The Prince of Monaco was now, in effect, the landlord of the most famous gambling den in the world. By the time Charles III died in 1889, Monaco had been transformed beyond recognition. The population had grown. The harbor was filled with yachts. The hillsides were dotted with villas built by the wealthy who had come for a season and decided to stay. The casino had become a European institution, its fame spreading to America, to Asia, to every corner of the globe where men dreamed of fortune and women dreamed of glamour. The Grimaldi name, once associated with medieval piracy and political survival, was now synonymous with luxury, with risk, with the intoxicating possibility of winning it all on a single spin of the wheel. But the transformation came at a cost that Charles's successors would have to bear. His son, Albert I, who inherited the throne in 1889, was a man utterly unlike his father. Albert was a scientist, an oceanographer, a man of reason and exploration. He spent more time on his research vessels in the Atlantic than he did in the palace. He founded the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco, a stunning monument to his passion for the sea. He corresponded with the leading minds of Europe and dreamed of a world where science would replace superstition, where knowledge would conquer ignorance. And yet Albert could not escape the casino. It funded his expeditions. It paid for his museum. It was the engine that drove his principality, and he knew it. The contradiction tormented him. In his private journals preserved in the palace archives, he wrestled with the moral implications of his inheritance. He wrote, "I am a prince of science, but I reign over a kingdom of chance. My people bless the name Grimaldi because they pay no taxes, but the taxes they do not pay are paid by the broken men who lose their fortunes at my table. I see them sometimes, walking the cliffs at dawn, their faces gray with loss. I do not know if I am a prince or a parasite." Albert's personal life mirrored this tension. His marriage to Lady Mary Victoria Hamilton, a Scottish noblewoman, was a disaster from the start. She hated Monaco, hated the casino, hated the gilded superficiality of court life. She fled the principality shortly after giving birth to their son, Louis, and spent the rest of her life in exile, estranged from her husband and her adopted country. The Grimaldi curse, it seemed, was still at work, even in an age of oceanography and electric lights. The dynasty had survived, had even prospered, but the old pattern of unhappy marriages, of isolated princes, of hearts broken on the altar of duty, persisted. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the Grimaldis faced a new question. They had survived revolution, curse, and financial ruin. They had built a glittering myth on a barren rock. But the world was changing faster than ever. Wars would soon engulf Europe. Empires would fall. The age of aristocracy was drawing to a close. In this new century, the Grimaldis would need more than luck. They would need a new kind of magic. And that magic would arrive in the most unexpected form imaginable. Not as a soldier or a diplomat, but as a woman with a face the whole world already knew. Chapter 6. The Hollywood Prince. The spring of 1955 arrived in Monaco as it always did, with a burst of mimosa, with the first warm breezes off the Ligurian Sea, with the slow creak of shuttered windows opening onto balconies that had faced the same view for 7 centuries. But this spring was different. This spring, a ghost was about to walk through the palace gates. Not a ghost of the dead, but a ghost of the imagined. A figure from the flickering screens of cinema, a woman whose face had been projected onto the dreams of millions. Her name was Grace Kelly, and when she stepped out of her limousine onto the sunlit cobblestones of the Place du Palais, the old stones themselves seemed to hold their breath. The meeting had been arranged as a publicity stunt, a photo opportunity for the editors of Paris Match magazine. Prince Rainier III, who had inherited the throne in 1949, was a young man struggling to modernize a principality still defined by its casino and its past. He was handsome in a formal European way, with the serious eyes of a man who had spent his youth studying in Swiss boarding schools and serving in the French Foreign Legion. He was, by all accounts, lonely. The palace was vast and silent. His mother, Princess Charlotte, had abdicated her rights years ago, fleeing the constraints of court life. Rainier ruled alone, surrounded by advisors and servants, but with few people he could truly call friend. Grace Kelly arrived in Monaco at the height of her fame. She had just won an Academy Award for her performance in The Country Girl. She had starred in Alfred Hitchcock's greatest film. She was the epitome of American grace, of cool blonde elegance, of a glamour that seemed effortless and eternal. She came to Monaco to take photographs, to smile for the cameras, to add a European prince to her collection of experiences. She did not expect to fall in love, but something happened during that first photo shoot. Rainier, stiff and formal in his palace uniform, offered to show Grace the private gardens, the rooms not open to the public, the places where the Grimaldi ghost still lingered. He walked her through the Hall of Mirrors, where Honoré II had awaited the Spanish cannon. He showed her the chapel where generations of Grimaldis had been baptized and buried. He spoke not as a prince showing off his domain, but as a man sharing his home, his history, his heart. And Grace, the movie star who had been pursued by the most eligible men in Hollywood, found herself drawn to this serious, solitary man with the weight of centuries on his shoulders. The photo shoot ended. Grace returned to America, but the letters did not stop. Rainier wrote to her almost daily, long letters in his careful, elegant handwriting. He wrote about his plans for Monaco, about his love of the sea, about the loneliness of his position. He wrote in one letter preserved in the family archives, "I have met many people in my life, but I have never met anyone who made me feel that I could be myself. With you, The prince disappears and only the man remains. Grace, reading those words in her Philadelphia apartment, felt the pull of a different kind of life. A life not of auditions and directors and the constant scrutiny of Hollywood, but of purpose, of tradition, of something real. The engagement, when it was announced in January 1956, sent shockwaves around the world. It was not just a wedding, it was a collision of worlds. Old Europe and New America, ancient aristocracy and modern celebrity. The press descended on Monaco in a frenzy that had no precedent. Hundreds of journalists, photographers, and newsreel cameramen flooded the tiny principality, turning every street, every cafe, every corner of the palace into a stage. The Grimaldis, who had survived centuries of wars and revolutions, now faced their most intimate challenge, a wedding conducted under the gaze of millions. For Rainier, the pressure was immense. He was not just marrying the woman he loved, he was choosing the mother of the next Grimaldi heir, the partner who would share the burden of the dynasty. The old worries, the curse, the unhappy marriages, the isolated princes, whispered at the edges of his joy. He confessed his fears to a close friend in a private conversation later recorded in a biography. "I am happy, yes, but I am also terrified. I am asking her to give up everything, her career, her country, her freedom, for a life she cannot possibly understand. What if she wakes up one day and hates me for it? What if the curse is real?" Grace, for her part, approached the wedding with the discipline of an actress preparing for the most important role of her life. She studied French obsessively. She read books about Monegasque history. She corresponded with Rainier's sister, trying to understand the complex dynamics of the Grimaldi family. She knew she was stepping into a world of rigid protocol, of ancient expectations, of a role that had broken women before her. But she also believed, with the fierce optimism that had carried her through Hollywood, that she could make it work. In a letter to her mother, she wrote, "I know they call it a curse. I know the history, but I am not Ippolita locked in a tower. I am not Marie humiliated by a husband's affairs. I am myself, and I will write my own story." The wedding itself was a fairy tale made manifest. On April 18, 1956, Grace Kelly sailed into the harbor of Monaco on an ocean liner, the SS Constitution, waving to a crowd that stretched for miles along the coastline. The next day, in the throne room of the palace, she became Her Serene Highness Princess Grace of Monaco. The civil ceremony was followed by a religious wedding in the Cathedral of Monaco, the same stone sanctuary where generations of Grimaldis lay buried. Grace wore a gown of ivory silk and antique lace, designed by Helen Rose of MGM, a gift from the studio that had made her a star. The world watched, enchanted. It seemed for one perfect moment that the curse had been broken, that the Grimaldis had finally found their happy ending. But fairy tales, as the Grimaldis knew better than anyone, are not real. They are stories we tell ourselves to make the darkness bearable. And the darkness, for Grace and Rainier, was never far away. The first years of the marriage were, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Grace gave birth to 3 children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, filling the palace with the sound of young voices, with the chaos of childhood, with a warmth the old stones had not felt for generations. Grace threw herself into her new role with characteristic dedication. She learned the intricacies of Monegasque politics. She founded charity, supported local artists, and used her fame to put Monaco on the map in ways the casino never could. She was, by every measure, an exemplary princess. But the pressures never stopped. The same press that had celebrated her wedding now hounded her every move. Photographers lurked outside the palace gates, waiting for a moment of private anguish to capture and sell. The tabloids printed rumors of marital strife, of Rainier's supposed affairs, of Grace's unhappiness. Most of it was fiction, but fiction, repeated often enough, can feel like truth. Grace, who had spent her life in the public eye, found the constant scrutiny exhausting. She once confided to a friend, "In Hollywood you could escape. You could close your door and be alone. Here the door is always open. The palace is a cage and everyone is watching." The old Grimaldi pattern of isolation began to reassert itself. Rainier, consumed by the demands of ruling, spent long hours in his office, leaving Grace to navigate the complexities of court life alone. The children grew older, more independent. Grace, who had given up her career, her country, her very identity for this life, found herself wondering who she was without the cameras, without the roles, without the constant validation of performance. She turned to poetry, to painting, to the quiet consolations of art, but the restlessness remained. The tragedy, when it came, was sudden and senseless. On September 13, 1982, Grace was driving with her daughter Stephanie along the winding roads of the Moyenne Corniche, the spectacular cliffside highway that overlooks Monaco. For reasons that have never been fully explained, her car veered off the road and plunged down a steep embankment. Grace suffered catastrophic injury. She died the next day in a Monaco hospital, surrounded by her family. She was 52 years old. The world mourned. The fairy tale was over. The princess who had brought Hollywood to the Rock was gone, and the Grimaldis were left to grieve under the same unblinking gaze that had celebrated their wedding. Rainier, shattered, withdrew into an even deeper isolation. He never remarried. For the remaining 23 years of his life, he wore black. The palace, which had briefly been filled with light, fell silent once more. The curse, if that is what it was, had claimed another victim. But the dynasty endured. And in the silence, a new heir was waiting. Albert, the son of the movie star and the prince, now carried the weight of 7 centuries on his shoulders. Chapter 7: The Heir and the Echo. The funeral of Prince Rainier III in April 2005 was a spectacle of grief and ceremony that Monaco had not witnessed since the death of Grace Kelly 23 years earlier. Crowned heads of Europe filed into the Cathedral of Monaco, the same stone sanctuary where Rainier had married his Hollywood starlet nearly 50 years before. The people of Monaco lined the streets in silent thousands, their faces etched with a sorrow that was both personal and historical. They were not just mourning a prince. They were mourning the end of an era. Rainier had ruled for 56 years, transforming his inherited principality from a faded relic of the casino age into a modern, prosperous state. He had been the architect of Monaco's resurrection, the man who had married the fairy tale and then lived through its aftermath. And now he was gone. In the front row of the cathedral, dressed in black, sat his son, Albert Alexander Louis Pierre Grimaldi, now His Serene Highness Prince Albert II of Monaco. He was 47 years old, a man who had spent his entire life in the shadow of his parents' legend. As the archbishop intoned the final prayers, as the incense curled toward the vaulted ceiling, as the cameras of the world's media captured every tear, Albert must have felt the weight of 7 centuries settle onto his shoulders. He was no longer the heir. He was the prince. And the question that hung in the incense-thick air was the same one that had greeted every Grimaldi ruler since Francesco il Malizia. What now? Albert's inheritance was paradoxical. On paper, Monaco had never been stronger. The economy, driven by banking, tourism, and a reputation as a tax haven, was booming. The population was growing. The skyline was changing. The future seemed bright. But beneath the surface, the old anxieties simmered. Albert was 50 and he was not married. He had no legitimate children. The Grimaldi curse, which had haunted the family's marriages for centuries, now manifested in a new form. The single prince, the bachelor ruler, the heir without an heir. The tabloids, which had once pursued Grace Kelly, now pursued her son, speculating endlessly about his love life, his relationships, his refusal to settle down. Monaco watched and waited. The dynasty, which had survived wars, revolutions, and financial ruin, now faced the most basic threat of all: extinction. Albert, for his part, approached his new role with a quiet determination that reminded observers of his father. He had been groomed for this his entire life, educated at Amherst College in the United States, trained in the intricacies of Monegasque politics, seasoned by years of representing his father at international events. He knew the weight of the crown. But he also knew something his father had perhaps not fully understood, that in the 21st century, a prince could not simply rule. He had to connect. He had to be visible, accessible, relevant. And so, in his first years as sovereign, Albert embarked on a series of initiatives that would define his reign and distinguish him from every Grimaldi who had come before. The first initiative was environmental. Albert had inherited his mother's love of nature and his father's sense of duty, and he combined them in a passion for the planet that would become the signature of his reign. He traveled to the North Pole, to the Antarctic, to the depths of the Amazon, documenting the effects of climate change and advocating for action. He established the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, dedicated to environmental protection and sustainable development. He used his platform, his name, his centuries of inherited privilege to speak for the ice caps and the rainforests, for species disappearing and oceans rising. It was a surprising direction for a Prince of Monaco, a ruler of a tiny Mediterranean tax haven. But it was also profoundly grimaldi, a recognition that survival in the modern world required adaptation, required looking beyond the walls of the palace, required finding a new way to be useful. The second initiative was personal, and it was far more complicated. For years, rumors had circulated about Albert's private life. The tabloids printed stories of relationships, of broken engagements, of a prince who could not commit. Then in 2005, shortly after his father's death, the rumors crystallized into something real. A woman came forward claiming that Albert was the father of her son, a boy born in 2003. The prince, after years of silence, did something unprecedented. He acknowledged the child. In a public statement, he confirmed his paternity and pledged to take legal and financial responsibility for the boy. It was a stunning break with Grimaldi tradition, an admission of the kind of personal truth that previous generations had buried in sealed archives and whispered gossip. The admission opened a floodgate. In 2006, a second child was acknowledged, a daughter born to a different woman. Albert, the bachelor prince, was suddenly revealed to be a father of two. The revelations shocked Monaco and captivated the world. Here was the heir to the Grimaldi curse, the man who had seemed unable to find a wife, publicly embracing children born outside the traditional lines of dynasty and legitimacy. It was, in its own way, as revolutionary as Francesco's midnight raid on the fortress. It was a recognition that the old rules, the old secrets, the old ways of protecting the family at all costs, no longer applied in a world of DNA tests and 24-hour news cycle. But the revelations also sharpened the central question of Albert's reign. His acknowledged children, however much he loved them, could not inherit the throne. Monegasque law, like most European succession laws, required legitimate birth. Albert still needed a wife. He still needed an heir. The dynasty, which had survived for 7 centuries, now depended on the most unpredictable of human variables: love. And love, as the Grimaldis knew better than anyone, was a gamble. The gamble paid off in 2010 when Albert announced his engagement to Charlene Wittstock, a South African Olympic swimmer. She was tall, blonde, athletic, superficially reminiscent of his mother, but entirely her own person. She was an outsider, a commoner, a woman from a world as far from Monaco as it was possible to be. She was also, by all accounts, deeply in love with the man, not the prince. The wedding in July 2011 was a fairy tale for a new generation, less star-studded than his parents, but no less watched, no less scrutinized, no less burdened with expectation. Monaco celebrated, the world watched, and the Grimaldi curse, that ancient whisper of marital doom, seemed once again to be defied. But the whispers never fully stopped. The tabloids, hungry for a story, seized on every nuance of Charlene's expression, every moment of distance between the couple, every rumor of pre-wedding cold feet. They wrote of Charlene's attempts to flee Monaco, of Albert's complications, of a marriage doomed from the start. Most of it was fiction, but fiction, as Grace Kelly had learned, has a way of becoming truth in the minds of those who consume it. Charlene, like every woman who had married into the Grimaldi family, found herself living in a cage of stories, not of her own making. In 2014, the dynasty received the news it had awaited for decades. Charlene was pregnant, and not just with one child, but with twins. The birth of Princess Gabriella and Prince Jacques in December of that year secured the Grimaldi succession for another generation. Jacques, as the firstborn son, became the hereditary prince, the heir to the rock, the latest in a line stretching back to Francesco il Malizia. The curse, if it existed, had been held at bay. The dynasty would continue. But what does it mean to continue? This is the question that hovers over the palace as the 21st century unfolds. Jacques, born in 2014, will inherit a Monaco vastly different from the one his ancestors knew. The casino, once the engine of the economy, is now a historical artifact, dwarfed by banking, real estate, and the globalized flow of capital. The palace, once a fortress, is now a museum, open to tourists who pay to walk the same halls where Honoré II awaited his doom. The Grimaldis, once pirates, once princes, once prisoners, are now something else entirely: celebrities, symbols, survivors. Albert, in his role as sovereign, embodies this contradiction. He is at once the most traditional of Grimaldis, bound by protocol, by history, by the weight of the crown, and the most modern, acknowledging his illegitimate children, championing environmental causes, navigating the treacherous currents of 21st century media. He walks the same corridors as Francesco, as Lucian, as Honoré, as Rainier, but the echoes he hears are different. They are echoes not of cannons and treaties, but of camera shutters and satellite signal, of a world that watches everything and forgets nothing. The rain falls on Monaco, as it did on that night in 1652 when Honoré II waited for the Spanish cannon. But the rain falls differently now. It falls on yachts in the harbor, on tourists huddled under awnings, on the gleaming glass of modern high-rises that have transformed the ancient skyline. In the palace, the Hall of Mirrors is empty. The candles are gone, replaced by electric lights that cast a steady, unromantic glow. The portrait of Francesco il Malizia hangs in a quiet corridor, his hooded eyes gazing out at visitors who pause for a moment before moving on to the gift shop. Prince Albert II stands at a window in his private apartments, looking out at the sea. Behind him in the nursery, his children sleep, Gabriella and Jacques, the latest inheritors of the dream. He thinks of his mother, Grace, and the fairy tale she brought to this place. He thinks of his father, Rainier, and the lonely decades of his widowhood. He thinks of Francesco, the ghost in the monk's hood, and the gamble he took on a moonless night 7 centuries ago. The same sea that carried Francesco's boat now carries container ships and superyachts. The same wind that howled around the medieval fortress now gusts through the streets of a modern city. But the rock remains. It endures. And on it, a family endures with it. The Grimaldi curse, if it exists, is not a supernatural punishment. It is the price of survival itself, the loneliness of power, the isolation of the throne, the burden of a name that must be carried generation after generation, no matter the cost. But the curse is also a gift. It is the force that has driven this family to adapt, to gamble, to reinvent themselves again and again. It is the echo that reminds each new prince that he is not just a man, but a link in a chain stretching back to the beginning and forward into the unknown. The harbor lights flicker on the water. Albert turns from the window. The palace is quiet. Tomorrow there will be meetings, decisions, the endless business of ruling. But tonight there is only the sea, the stone, and the silence. The Grimaldis have survived. The question now is not whether they will endure, but what they will become. And that answer, like the future itself, belongs not to history, but to the heirs who will write it.